All right, I want to devote this video to a discussion of Confucius and the Analects. We need to read this kind of in two ways here, in keeping with the class assignments. One is to try to understand Confucius in context, right? That is, in the Warring States period of the mid-first millennium BCE when he lived. But then, we also are engaging with Karen Armstrong's argument that, and not original to her necessarily, but, this idea of an axial age, that, Confucianism is one of a number of religions and philosophical systems that show up around the same time, that all lead to a set of ethical teachings, right, that can be kind of summarized by the Golden Rule. And so we need to, read this kind of in connection with that as well. So I'm going to try to do both of those things here. What can we say about the context of Confucius? The Latinized form of that name, of course, is Confucius. That name doesn't get used actually until the 16th century. It's a Jesuit, European Jesuit friar who attaches the kind of Latinized name Confucius. Confucius just means Master Kong, which is what he's, of course, known in Chinese. The picture you see here is one of the earliest surviving, or the oldest surviving depictions of him. It comes from, I believe, like the 1st century CE or something like that. But in the Warring States period, which we discussed briefly in an earlier video, right, you have the Zhou rulers. Now, down here you have a map. Zhou was here kind of in the lower reaches of the... let me see if I can actually raise that up a little bit here. Well, it's close to the Yellow River, kind of the upper reaches of the Yellow River basin. Confucius himself lived in Lu province. The Zhou had united all of these territories throughout China, but, by the 6th century when he was living, most of these had become autonomous. There was still a Zhou ruler, a king there, but was not well respected. And this is one of the things that concerned Confucius. He looked at the earlier history of the Zhou as well as of the earlier dynasties, the Shang and the Xia, and found examples of what he considered good rulership, good behavior, and drew a lot of his inspiration from those things. And so that's the context in which he was writing. He lived in Lu province for most of his life. He did spend about 13 years in exile. I'll talk about that. But even in Lu province, the central authority, the Duke of Lu, had his... well, there was a succession crisis about 100 years before Confucius. I don't want to get too much into the weeds on this. But this led to the recognition of kind of the nobility of these three powerful hereditary families, the Ji, the Meng, and the Shu, who in some ways challenged the Duke, and this led to a further kind of deterioration of centralized authority and further chaos, as Confucius saw it. Confucius did rise through the ranks. He was born into the group who were kind of between the aristocracy and the common people, which means that he, was able to receive an education and take a job as a government minister. He rose up through different positions, ultimately becoming, his highest position was called Minister of Crime, which involved not just like prosecuting crimes, but also matters of warfare and these sorts of things. His main policy recommendation to the Duke, in order to restore what he saw as the, kind of the right way of things, which is a greater centralized authority, one where the Duke would be in charge and people would give him respect, and, kind of the lessening of the power of these other hereditary families. His main policy recommendation was to set out a decree for these families to dismantle the walls around their fortified cities. Fortified cities, of course, signaled that you were ready to fight, and these families had often fought each other and continued to fight each other during the the reign of, or during the time of Confucius, I should say. And so, he initially got, and now there's a lot that happens during this period. I don't have time to go into all of the details. But there were a couple of rebellions during his career as Minister of Crime. Kind of lower nobility in a couple of these families rose up and challenged the power of the Duke. This led to warfare. And even though all three families at one point agreed to dismantle their walls and restore peace and harmony, they never kind of followed through on that, right? And they continued to challenge the power of the Duke. The Duke himself misbehaved, as Confucius saw it, and specifically, he took bribes from the Duke of Qi, which is if we go back to this map, right, you can see that Qi is the province just to the north of Lu. He took a massive bribe, to effectively let the Qi kind of have their way further destabilizing the Zhou. Confucius was upset with the Duke over this. He didn't withdraw from his position because he didn't want this to disgrace the Duke, but he later left in a kind of self-exile, a voluntary exile. And for 13 years, he traveled around to different provinces. He never attained a government position again. But he did teach and gain a lot of disciples during this sojourn. He returned in the year 484 when he was about, 67, 68 years old, and spent the last few years of his life before his death in 479 with a kind of school of disciples. Now, Confucius, did have some tragedy occur. Some of his favorite disciples died rather young. His own sons, I believe, preceded him in death, and so he didn't necessarily have heirs, right? So he had kind of a sad older life. But his disciples collected his teachings, initially into these books called the Five Classics, but over time, some of his sayings were gathered together in this text that was called the Analects. And this eventually surpassed the Five Classics, which I believe don't exist, or they're not extant, at least in their full form. The Analects was the one that really inspired the later developments of Confucianism. And we can see some evidence of that in the text, that maybe some of these sayings attributed to Confucius were kind of interpolations of later thinkers, right, attributing these things to him to kind of attach themselves to his authority. All right, so that, I think, hopefully gives us some pretty good background on Confucius. Let's talk about a few of the key principles in the Analects. There's a really good discussion of this in the textbook, so I don't want to kind of overrun what was said there, right? Perhaps the two most important principles, and these exist in a close relationship with each other, are characterized by the Chinese words li and ren. Li is translated in the text usually as rites, and this does mean things like religious rites, religious ceremonies. There were lots of these in celebration or in praise of the various deities and ancestors. But there were also rites that existed within families. Children would, perform rituals for their parents, to kind of venerate their parents, for instance. Young people would do that for their elders. And so rites is more all-encompassing. It means not just the actions of the rituals, but also the kind of the proper ordering of society, making sure that everyone knows their place, right? And certain people, depending on their station, their position, were able to perform certain rites, and others weren't. And at times in the Analects, we see Confucius or his disciples saying, I don't know if he performed the rite correctly because I'm not in a position to perform that rite. I can't say. Now, this ritualistic aspect was important, but and here's the really important connection, I think, right? Li done without ren is meaningless. And if you can kind of get that in your mind, right? Ren means something like virtue, a sort of all-encompassing virtue. It's often translated as humaneness, but that doesn't necessarily capture it. And frankly, the exact meaning of Ren is never spelled out in so many words in the text. The disciples ask Confucius repeatedly all through this text to try to pin him down on what he means by Ren, and he usually just gives examples. These little anecdotes about people who exercised Ren, and it's like, well, that's an example, but what does that tell us? And Confucius is often cagey about this, right? So Ren is something you have to kind of get a feel for in the text. Another concept that is important is the identification of, this is kind of a label that he attaches to people. It's junji. It's usually translated as gentleman, right? So the junji will practice the rites correctly, and he will do it with the right intent. He will do it with virtue. In other words, he will combine Li and Ren. And that is, like I said, the essential connection between those two. Now, as far as solving the ills of society in the Warring States period, well, Confucius says, and let me go to the text here to get a better sense of this, right? Here, I've got the electronic version. This is the Penguin edition, I believe, that you may have in hard copy. In 1.2, and I've only given you the first 5 books to read, but there's plenty of examples of all of these concepts in these first 5 books. And this isn't actually Confucius. The Analects has sayings of Confucius, but also sayings of many of his disciples. Master Yu, this is Yu, said, "It is rare for a person who is filial to his parents and respectful to his elders to be inclined to transgress against his superiors. And it has never happened that a person who is not inclined to transgress against his superiors is inclined to create chaos. A gentleman," that's the word junji, "looks after the roots. With the roots firmly established, a moral way will grow. Is it not true, then, that being filial to one's parents and being respectful to one's elders are the roots of one's humanity?" Right? Now, the reason that I wanted to kind of quote that is that this really stands at the heart of everything that Confucius taught, right? He says that there are these essential relationships, and if we observe these relationships properly, and to observe the relationships properly, you have to do the Li, and you have to do it with Ren. You have to cultivate Ren and perform Li. In other words, you have to be a junji. Then all of society will be in harmony, right? The 5 essential relationships that Confucius writes about are the ruler to the subject, the husband to the wife, and these are all, they're all hierarchical. The father to son, or parent to child, we might say. Older brother to younger brother, and then the 5th one is actually not hierarchical, it's more horizontal, it's friend to friend, right? If we, as I said, perform Li and do it with Ren, within those relationships, all of the ills of society will be solved. And he gives example after example of all of these things. And he stresses the importance of education. We have to teach people to do these things. He himself becomes the example of that, right? There are lots of texts that we could look at for all of these, but I would encourage you just to look through the text and try to find, where he points out Li and points out Ren, and try to, sort of contextualize all of this. I kind of want to make you do the work here, I guess is what I'm saying. I think one final text that I will point out, though. Let's see. Let's go to the table of contents here. Book 2. This is section 21 of Book 2. Okay. Someone said to Confucius, "Why do you not take part in government?" Now, remember, he was exiled. He didn't have a government position, for much of his later life. The master said, "The book of documents says, filial, only be filial, and a friend to your older and younger brothers. This has an influence on the way of government. To do this is to take part in government. Why must I take on a position in order to take part in government? He says, essentially, everyone is part of government. Everyone can contribute to the proper ordering of society. We just have to act properly within those relationships. And then the society will function properly. Okay. Let me just say, without pointing these out, because I want to end this video soon, there's a really good passage on Li at the beginning of Book 3, parts 1 and 2 here, sections 1 and 2. Take a look at 3.1 and 3.2 to try to understand Li, because this refers directly to some of the violations of Li that he saw in his own day by these 3 hereditary families. Notice that he says the 3 families here, right? So that's an important piece of context. All of Book 4, pretty much, is a discussion of Ren. And so, there's just so much about Ren here. I find particularly section 5 and 6 here of Book 4 to be, kind of potent about Ren. And then it also brings up the concept of the Junji, the gentleman, and its connection with Ren here. All right, so hopefully that gives you some good context and good information to help you make sense of the Confucius Analects. And look forward to discussing this with you in class and on discussion board. Thank you.